When a broken woman arrived at his remote ranch carrying the child of her abuser, the solitary rancher made a choice that would change 3 lives forever. He opened his heart to raise a child that wasn't his own, becoming the father figure neither of them ever expected to find. But what drove a man who had sworn off family to risk everything for strangers? It all started when Thomas Hartwell lowered his rifle and watched the wolf run into the tall grass, blood trailing behind it. The beast had been after his cattle again, but this time it got away wounded and angry. He turned toward his small wooden house, but stopped when he saw something moving in the distance. A person was walking across his land, but something was wrong. The figure kept stumbling, falling, then getting back up. Thomas squinted his eyes and saw it was a woman in a dark dress. She was holding her stomach like she was hurt. The woman fell down again, but this time she didn't get up. Thomas ran toward her, his boots pounding on the hard dirt. The Nebraska Territory was a dangerous place in 1867, especially for someone alone. Wild animals, bad weather, and worse men all waited to hurt anyone who wasn't careful. When he reached her, Thomas could see she was young, maybe 20 years old. Her brown hair was messy and full of dirt, her dress was torn in 3 places, and her face was pale as winter snow. But what made Thomas's heart race was her belly. She was going to have a baby. And soon, "Ma'am," Thomas said softly, kneeling down beside her. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" The woman's eyes opened slowly. They were green like spring grass, but filled with fear. When she saw Thomas, she tried to crawl away from him. "Please don't hurt me," she whispered. "I don't have any money. I don't have anything." "I'm not going to hurt you," Thomas said, keeping his voice quiet like he did when he talked to scared horses. "My name is Thomas Hartwell. This is my land. You're safe now." The woman stared at him for a long moment, like she was trying to decide if he was telling the truth. Thomas had learned to read people during the war, and he could see she had been hurt badly by someone. The way she held herself, the way she looked at him, someone had done terrible things to her. "Can you stand up?" Thomas asked. "I need to get you inside before the storm comes." Dark clouds were rolling in from the west, and the wind was getting stronger. Thomas could smell snow in the air. If they didn't get to shelter soon, they would both be in trouble. The woman tried to sit up, but cried out in pain. "The baby!" she gasped. "Something's wrong with the baby." Thomas felt his stomach drop. He had helped birth calves and foals, but never a human baby. The nearest doctor was 3 days away by horse, and the nearest town was 2 days. If this woman was having her baby now, Thomas would have to help her by himself. "What's your name?" Thomas asked, carefully lifting her up. She was lighter than he expected, like she hadn't eaten enough food in weeks. "Eliza," she said, gripping his shirt. "Eliza Morrison." Thomas carried her toward his house, walking as smoothly as he could. Behind them, the first snowflakes began to fall. The wounded wolf howled somewhere in the distance, a sound that made Thomas walk faster. His house was small but warm. Thomas had built it himself after the war, when he decided he needed to find peace on the prairie. It had 2 rooms downstairs and a small room upstairs where he slept. The main room had a fireplace, a wooden table, and 2 chairs he had made from trees on his land. Thomas laid Eliza on his bed, which was in the smaller room next to the kitchen. She was shivering, so he covered her with his best blanket, the one his mother had made before she died. "I need to check on my animals," Thomas said. "The storm's getting worse. Will you be all right for a few minutes?" Eliza nodded, but Thomas could see she was scared to be alone. He wished he could stay with her, but his horses and cattle would die in the cold if he didn't get them to shelter. Thomas ran to his barn and led his 3 horses inside. Then he called his cattle, and they came running when they heard the storm getting louder. The snow was falling harder now, and the wind was howling like the injured wolf. When Thomas got back to the house, he found Eliza trying to get out of bed. "I should go," she said. "I shouldn't stay here. You don't know me. You don't know what I've done. You're not going anywhere in this storm," Thomas said firmly. "And I don't care what you think you've done. Right now, you need help, and I'm the only one here to give it. Eliza looked at him with those green eyes, and Thomas saw something he recognized. It was the same look he had seen in his own mirror after the war, the look of someone who had lost everything and didn't know how to trust anyone anymore. Thunder crashed outside, and Eliza jumped. Thomas noticed she put her hands over her belly like she was protecting the baby from the sound. "Are you hungry?" Thomas asked. "I have soup on the stove." "I haven't eaten in 2 days," Eliza admitted quietly. Thomas brought her a bowl of beef soup and watched her eat. She was definitely hungry. She finished the whole bowl in less than 5 minutes. But she kept looking at the door like she expected someone bad to come through it. "Who are you running from?" Thomas asked. Eliza stopped eating. Her face went white again, and her hands started shaking. "I can't tell you," she whispered. "If I tell you, you'll make me leave. Or worse, you'll send me back to him." Thomas sat down in the chair next to the bed. Outside, the storm was getting worse. The wind was so loud it sounded like a train was coming through his walls. "Lady, I've been through a war," Thomas said. "I've seen men do terrible things to each other. Whatever happened to you, I've probably seen worse. And I promise you this, nobody is taking you anywhere you don't want to go. Not while you're on my land." Eliza stared at him for a long time. Then she started crying, not loud crying, but quiet tears that rolled down her cheeks like rain on a window. "He said he was a man of God," she finally whispered. "He said he was going to help me, but he lied about everything." Morning came with bright sunlight that made the snow sparkle like diamonds. Thomas woke up on the floor of the main room, where he had slept so Eliza could have the bed. His back hurt from sleeping on the hard wood, but he had slept in worse places during the war. He could hear Eliza moving around in the other room, so he knew she was awake. Thomas started a fire in the stove and put coffee on to boil. The smell of coffee always made everything seem better. "Good morning," Eliza said softly from the doorway. She had combed her hair and tried to fix her torn dress, but Thomas could see she was still scared. "Morning," Thomas replied. "Coffee will be ready soon. How are you feeling?" "Better," Eliza said, but Thomas noticed she was holding her stomach again. "The baby's moving a lot today." "When is it due?" Thomas asked, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups. "Soon, I think. Maybe 2 weeks, maybe less." Eliza sat down at the table carefully. "I don't know much about babies. My mother died when I was little, and I never had sisters." Thomas handed her the coffee and sat across from her. In the daylight, he could see that Eliza was pretty, but she looked tired and worried. Her green eyes kept moving around the room like she was looking for danger. "Tell me about this man," Thomas said. "The one who hurt you." Eliza's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "His name is Reverend Caldwell. He came to our town in Missouri with a wagon full of books and medicine. He said he was starting a mission in the territories, and he needed people to help him." "What kind of mission?" Thomas asked. "To bring God to the frontier towns," Eliza said. "To help people who didn't have churches or schools. My father thought it was a good idea. He said I should go with Reverend Caldwell and learn to be a teacher." Thomas could already guess what happened next, but he let her tell the story her own way. "At first, everything seemed fine," Eliza continued. "There were 6 of us, 3 men and 3 women. We traveled for 2 weeks, and Reverend Caldwell was kind to everyone. He read the Bible every night and talked about doing God's work." Eliza stopped talking and stared into her coffee. Thomas waited. He had learned during the war that sometimes people needed time to find the right words for bad things. "Then we got to a town called Cedar Falls," Eliza said finally. "It was small, maybe 50 people. The townspeople were happy to see us. They gave us a place to stay and food to eat. But that first night," Eliza's voice broke, and she started crying again. Thomas reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Her fingers were cold and shaking. "He came to my room," Eliza whispered. "He said God had told him I was meant to be his wife. I said no, but he was stronger than me. The other people in our group, they didn't help me. They said I must have done something to tempt him. Thomas felt anger rising in his chest like fire. He had met men like this Caldwell during the war, men who used God's name to do evil things. "How did you get away?" Thomas asked. "I waited until everyone was asleep. Then I took a horse and rode away," Eliza said. "I've been traveling for 3 weeks, trying to get far enough away that he won't find me. But the horse went lame 2 days ago, and I had to leave it behind." "He's still looking for you?" "Yes." Eliza's voice was so quiet Thomas almost couldn't hear her. "He thinks the baby belongs to him. He thinks I belong to him. He told people in every town that I stole money from the mission, so they would help him find me." Thomas stood up and walked to the window. The snow had stopped, and the sky was clear blue. His land looked peaceful and clean, but Thomas knew that peace could be broken easily by bad men. "You can stay here," Thomas said, turning back to Eliza. "As long as you need to." "You don't understand," Eliza said, shaking her head. "He's not going to give up. And when people find out about the baby, they'll think I'm a bad woman. They'll want me to leave." "Let me worry about what people think," Thomas said. "This is my land, and I decide who stays and who goes." Eliza looked at him with surprise. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Thomas sat back down at the table. This was a hard question, because he wasn't sure he knew the answer himself. Maybe it was because he remembered what it felt like to be alone and scared. Maybe it was because his house had been too quiet for too long. Or maybe it was because he could see that Eliza was a good person who had been hurt by someone evil. "During the war, I was wounded in a battle," Thomas said. "I was lying in a field for 2 days waiting to die. Then a farmer found me and took me to his house. His wife took care of me for 3 months until I was strong enough to travel. They didn't know me, but they saved my life anyway." "What happened to them?" Eliza asked. "Confederate soldiers burned their farm and killed them both," Thomas said. "I've always wondered if I could have saved them if I had stayed, but I was young and stupid, and I thought I needed to get back to the war." Thomas paused and looked at Eliza. "Maybe this is my chance to pay back what they did for me." Eliza was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "What if Caldwell comes here? What if he brings other men with him?" "Then we'll deal with it," Thomas said simply. "But until then, you're safe here." That afternoon, Thomas showed Eliza around his small farm. He had 30 cattle, 3 horses, and some chickens. His vegetable garden was covered with snow now, but in the spring it would grow corn, beans, and squash. There was a creek that ran through his land, so he always had fresh water. "It's beautiful," Eliza said, watching the cattle gather around the hay Thomas had put out for them. "So peaceful." "It is now," Thomas agreed. "But it took me 3 years to make it this way. When I first came here, there was nothing but grass and sky." They walked back to the house as the sun was setting. The snow made everything look clean and new, like the world was starting over. "Thomas," Eliza said as they reached the porch, "what will happen when the baby comes? I don't know how to take care of a child by myself." Thomas looked at her serious face and made a decision that would change both their lives. "You won't be by yourself," he said. "We'll figure it out together." But even as he said the words, Thomas wondered if they would have enough time before Reverend Caldwell found them. The sound of breaking dishes crashed through the morning air like gunshots. Thomas rushed into the kitchen to find Eliza standing over shattered plates, her face pale as fresh snow, hands shaking like autumn leaves. "I'm sorry," she whispered, dropping to her knees to gather the pieces. "I'm so clumsy. I'll replace them somehow, I promise." Thomas knelt beside her, his rough hands covering her trembling ones. "Plates can be replaced. People can't." He helped her stand, noting how she still flinched when he moved too fast. "Besides, I never liked those plates much anyway. They were my mother's, and she had terrible taste." A tiny smile crossed Eliza's lips before disappearing again. It was the first time he'd seen even a hint of happiness since she arrived. That afternoon, Thomas watched from the barn as Eliza attempted to hang laundry on the line. The autumn wind kept stealing the sheets from her grasp, wrapping them around her growing belly like white ghosts. Her frustration mounted with each failed attempt, and Thomas could see tears beginning to form. He walked over quietly. Wynn's got a mind of its own today. Everything has a mind of its own except me, she said bitterly. I can't even hang clothes properly anymore. Thomas studied her face, seeing something deeper than frustration. You know, I've been hanging laundry wrong for 5 years. Maybe you could show me the right way? She looked at him with surprise. You want me to teach you? Figure we could both learn together. They worked side by side, Thomas deliberately making mistakes so she could correct him. With each successful sheet hung, her confidence grew a little more. By evening, the clothesline was full, and Eliza was actually laughing at Thomas's exaggerated struggles with a stubborn pillowcase. That night at dinner, Thomas brought up the subject he'd been avoiding. Winter's coming fast. Town's a hard ride when the snow gets deep. Eliza's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Are you asking me to leave before then? I'm asking you to stay through it. The words came out faster than he intended. Baby's due in spring. Roads will be too dangerous for traveling. She set down her fork carefully. I won't be a burden on you, Thomas. I can earn my keep. This isn't about earning anything. Thomas pushed food around his plate, trying to find the right words. I lived alone here for 5 years after the war. Thought I preferred it that way. But having someone to cook for, someone to talk to, I forgot what that felt like. Eliza studied his weathered face in the lamplight. What if the baby cries too much? What if I'm not a good mother? What if you are? Thomas interrupted gently. What if that baby is exactly what this old house needs? The next morning, Thomas found Eliza in his small library, running her fingers along the spines of his books. She jumped when he entered, like she'd been caught stealing. I didn't mean to snoop, she said quickly. I love books. I used to teach school back in Missouri before. She trailed off, the shadow of her past crossing her face. Thomas pulled down a worn copy of poetry. Take any you want. They've been lonely on those shelves. You won't mind if I read to the baby? She asked, her hand moving to her belly. I know it sounds silly, but I want him to know stories and words and beautiful things. Doesn't sound silly at all. Thomas meant it. Reckon a baby should know about beautiful things from the start. That afternoon brought their first real test. Thomas was shoeing his horse when he heard shouting from the direction of the house. He ran toward the noise to find Eliza backing away from a man on horseback, Jake Morrison, a drifter known for trouble. Just being friendly, lady, Morrison was saying, his voice oily with false kindness. No need to be rude to a neighbor. Thomas stepped between them, his hammer still in his hand. Problem here, Jake? Morrison's eyes shifted from Thomas to Eliza and back. No problem, Tom. Just saying hello to your guest. My wife, Thomas said clearly, the lie rolling off his tongue like truth, and she's busy with household chores. Morrison's grin faded. Wife? That's interesting. Don't recall hearing about any wedding. Don't recall asking for your opinion. Thomas's voice carried the quiet authority of a man who'd faced down Confederate cavalry. Think it's time you moved along. After Morrison rode away, Eliza turned to Thomas with wide eyes. Why did you tell him I was your wife? Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks. Seemed like the smart thing to say. Men like Morrison. They leave married women alone. But now people will think, let them think what they want. Thomas met her gaze steadily. Question is, what do you think? She was quiet for a long moment. I think you're a good man, Thomas Hartwell. Better than I deserve. We all deserve better than we think, he replied. Question is whether we're brave enough to take it when it comes. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Thomas pulled out a wooden box from under his bed. Inside were letters, faded photographs, and a small velvet ring box. This was my grandmother's ring, he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold band with a tiny diamond. Been waiting for the right person to wear it. Eliza's breath caught. Thomas, I can't. You barely know me, my past, the baby. I know you hum when you're happy. I know you cry when you think no one can hear. I know you protect that baby with your life. He closed the box and set it on the table between them. The rest we can learn together. She stared at the ring box like it might bite her. What if I can't be what you need? What if you're exactly what I need? Thomas countered. What if we're both exactly what we need? The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and reminding them both that winter was coming whether they were ready or not. In the morning, Eliza would have to decide whether to trust this lonely rancher with her future and her child's life. But tonight, for the first time in months, she felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. The first blizzard hit 3 days before Christmas, burying the world in white silence that made everything beyond the windows disappear. Thomas woke to find Eliza standing at the kitchen window, her breath fogging the glass as she stared into the swirling snow. It's like the whole world ended, she whispered, her voice tight with worry. Thomas joined her at the window, noting how she didn't step away when he got close anymore. Looks scary, but we're ready for it. Got enough food stored to last until spring, plenty of firewood, and the animals are safe in the barn. What if the baby comes early? What if something goes wrong? Her hand moved to her growing belly, now round as a summer melon. Then we handle it, Thomas said simply. Same way folks have been handling winter babies for hundreds of years. But as the days stretched into weeks of endless white, Thomas began to understand Eliza's fears. The isolation was complete. No neighbors, no town, no help if things went wrong. Just the two of them in a world that had shrunk down to the walls of his small house. The first real test came when Thomas caught fever in January. He tried to hide it, working through chills and dizziness until he collapsed while feeding the cattle. Eliza found him face down in the snow, barely conscious. Thomas! Thomas, wake up! She struggled to pull him upright, her pregnant belly making it hard to balance. Please don't leave me alone out here. For 3 days, she nursed him through the fever, bringing cool cloths for his burning forehead and forcing him to drink broth when he could barely stay awake. Thomas drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes thinking he was back in the war, sometimes calling for his mother. On the 4th morning, his fever broke. He opened his eyes to find Eliza asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, one hand still holding a damp cloth. Eliza, he said softly. She jerked awake, her eyes immediately searching his face. How do you feel? Like I got trampled by a herd of buffalo, Thomas admitted. But alive, thanks to you. Tears filled her eyes. I was so scared. I didn't know what I'd do if you. Hey, Thomas reached for her hand, surprised when she didn't pull away. I'm not going anywhere. You promise? I promise. From that day forward, something changed between them. The careful politeness disappeared, replaced by the easy comfort of people who'd seen each other at their worst and stayed anyway. February brought a different kind of challenge. Cabin fever set in like a slow sickness, making them both snappy and restless. The walls seemed to close in a little more each day, and their conversations grew shorter and sharper. The breaking point came over something as silly as how to stack firewood. That's not how you do it, Eliza said, watching Thomas arrange logs by the fireplace. If you stack them that way, they won't dry properly. Been stacking firewood for 30 years, Thomas replied, his voice tighter than usual. Think I know what I'm doing? I'm just trying to help. Don't need help with firewood. Fine. Eliza turned away, her movements sharp with frustration. I won't try to help with anything else either. They didn't speak for 2 days. The silence felt heavier than the snow outside, pressing down on them until Thomas couldn't stand it anymore. He found Eliza in the small bedroom, mending baby clothes by lamplight. Her needle moved with angry precision, stabbing through the fabric like she was fighting a battle. I'm sorry, he said from the doorway. She didn't look up. For what? For being a stubborn fool, for taking my bad mood out on you, he paused, struggling for words, for making you feel like you don't belong here. Eliza's needle stilled. Do I belong here, Thomas? More than I do, he said honestly. This house was just a place I slept before you came. Now it feels like home. She finally looked at him, and he saw forgiveness in her green eyes. I'm sorry too. I know I'm difficult sometimes. I'm not used to having someone care what happens to me. Well, get used to it, Thomas said, because I do care, more than I probably should. The next challenge came from an unexpected direction. While checking the animals one morning, Thomas discovered that his prize bull had somehow gotten into the grain store and eaten himself sick. The animal was bloated and in pain, barely able to stand. What's wrong with him? Eliza asked, following Thomas to the barn, despite his protest that she should stay inside. Grain bloat. Ate too much too fast. Thomas examined the suffering animal with worried eyes. Might lose him. What can we do? Not much. Keep him walking if possible. Try to get the gas to pass. Thomas's voice was grim. This bull represents most of my breeding stock. If he dies, Eliza was quiet for a moment. In Missouri, my father was a veterinarian. I used to help him with sick animals. Thomas looked at her with surprise. You never mentioned that. You never asked about my past. She moved closer to the bull, her movements calm and confident. There's something we can try, but it's risky. Together, they worked through the day and into the night, taking turns walking the bull around the barn, massaging his sides, and administering the remedies Eliza remembered from her childhood. Thomas watched her work with growing amazement. This was a side of her he'd never seen, confident, knowledgeable, completely in control. By morning, the bull was better. Not completely well, but out of danger. You saved him, Thomas said, exhaustion and gratitude mixing in his voice. We saved him, Eliza corrected. I couldn't have done it alone. Seems like you know a lot more about doctoring than you let on. She was quiet for a long moment. My father wanted me to be a teacher, but I loved working with animals. He said it wasn't proper work for a lady. Her hand moved to her belly. Maybe I can teach this little one about both books and animals. Maybe you can teach me too, Thomas said, about the animal doctoring. I mean, could be useful to know. As winter began to loosen its grip in early March, Thomas realized that somewhere between the fever and the fights and the long nights talking by the fire, Eliza had stopped being his guest and started being his partner. They worked together like they'd been doing it for years, anticipating each other's needs, sharing the load without discussion. But the biggest change was in how they looked at each other. The careful distance had disappeared, replaced by something warmer and more dangerous. Thomas caught himself watching her hum while she cooked, and sometimes he caught her watching him too. Neither of them spoke about it yet, but it hung in the air between them like a promise waiting to be kept. The screaming started at midnight and didn't stop for 12 hours. Thomas stood in his kitchen, watching the ceiling shake as Eliza fought the hardest battle of her life above him. Mrs. Peterson, the town's only midwife, rushed between the bedroom and the kitchen, her face growing more worried with each trip. More hot water, she called down, and clean towels. All of them. Thomas had fought in 3 major battles during the war. He had seen men die and watched cities burn, but nothing had prepared him for this kind of helplessness. Every cry from upstairs cut through him like a knife. He wanted to help, but there was nothing a man could do except wait and pray. The storm outside matched the chaos inside. Rain pounded against the windows while thunder shook the whole house. Lightning lit up the prairie in bright flashes, making everything look scary and wild. Thomas thought it was like the whole world was fighting alongside Eliza. Is she going to be okay? He asked Mrs. Peterson during one of her trips downstairs. The older woman paused, wiping sweat from her forehead. First babies are always hard work. She's strong, Thomas. Stronger than she knows. But her eyes told a different story. Thomas saw the worry hiding behind her calm words. Hour 6 brought new fears. Eliza's voice grew weaker. The spaces between her cries grew longer. Mrs. Peterson stopped coming downstairs, and Thomas heard her moving around quickly above him. He wanted to run up there and see what was happening, but the midwife had made him promise to stay away. Some things are women's work, she had said. You help by staying out of the way. Thomas heated more water and folded more towels. He swept the floor 3 times. He checked on the animals in the barn twice, getting soaked both times. Anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from thinking the worst thoughts. Around hour 9, something changed. Mrs. Peterson called down with a different voice, stronger, more hopeful. She's doing better now. The baby is coming. Thomas felt his knees go weak with relief. He sat down hard in his kitchen chair and put his head in his hands. All this time, he had been so scared of losing both of them. The thought of going back to his empty house, with no sounds of life, made his chest hurt. But then a new fear hit him. What if the baby looked like its real father? What if every time Thomas looked at the child, he would see that evil man's face? Could he love a baby that reminded him of someone so terrible? Thomas pushed those thoughts away. This baby was Eliza's. That was all that mattered. Hour 11 brought the sound he had been waiting for. A thin, angry cry pierced through the storm noise. Thomas jumped up so fast he knocked over his chair. The baby was here. The baby was alive. Mrs. Peterson's voice floated down the stairs. "Thomas, come up here." He climbed those steps like a man walking to church. His legs shook, but not from fear this time. When he reached the bedroom door, Mrs. Peterson smiled at him. "You have a son," she said. Thomas looked past her to the bed where Eliza lay. She looked pale and tired, but her eyes were bright. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in the soft yellow blanket she had knitted during the long winter months. "Come see him," Eliza whispered. Thomas walked to the bed slowly, like he was approaching something holy. The baby was smaller than he had expected, red-faced and wrinkled, with a little bit of dark hair sticking up everywhere. His tiny fists waved in the air like he was boxing with invisible enemies. "He's perfect," Thomas said, and meant it. The baby's eyes opened for just a moment. They were gray-blue, like storm clouds. Thomas felt something break open in his chest, something warm and protective and fierce. "What should we call him?" Eliza asked. Thomas thought about his brother Matthew, who had died at Bull Run, a good man who never got the chance to have a family of his own. "Matthew," he said, "if you like it." Eliza smiled, the first real smile he had seen from her since that day by the well. Matthew Hartwell. She said it like she was testing how the name sounded. Thomas felt his heart skip. "You want him to have my name?" he asked. "Don't you want to be his father?" Thomas reached out one finger and touched the baby's tiny hand. Little Matthew grabbed on tight, like he never wanted to let go. "Yes," Thomas said. "More than anything." Mrs. Peterson watched them from the corner, packing up her supplies. She had delivered dozens of babies, but something about this moment felt different, special, like she was watching the start of something important. "He's going to be a strong one," she said. "Born in a storm, raised by good people. That boy will do great things." Thomas held his son for the first time as the storm outside began to calm. Lightning still flashed, but the thunder was moving away. The worst was over. Little Matthew made soft baby sounds and settled into his father's arms like he belonged there. Thomas looked down at the tiny face and saw only innocence, only possibility, only love. All his fears about the baby's real father melted away. This was his son now, his family, his responsibility, and his joy. "Welcome home, Matthew," he whispered. Outside, the sun broke through the storm clouds for the first time in days, filling the room with golden light. It felt like a blessing, like the start of everything good. 2-year-old Matthew Hartwell could outrun a chicken, charm a grumpy horse, and turn any quiet morning into an adventure that left his parents laughing until their sides hurt. But on this particular Tuesday morning, his usual mischief would be interrupted by a visitor who brought the kind of news that changes everything. Thomas watched from the kitchen window as Matthew chased their old rooster around the yard, giggling every time the bird squawked and flapped its wings. The boy had his mother's bright green eyes and his father's stubborn streak. When he wanted something, he went after it with the determination of a full-grown man. "Papa, Papa, come see!" Matthew called out. pointing excitedly at something in the dirt. Thomas stepped outside, wiping his hands on his work shirt. These morning moments with his son had become his favorite part of each day. Better than coffee for waking up his heart. "What did you find, little man?" "Worm," Matthew announced proudly, holding up a fat earthworm that wiggled between his tiny fingers. "Big worm." "That's a good one," Thomas agreed seriously. "Worms help our garden grow." Matthew considered this information, then carefully placed the worm back in the dirt and patted the spot gently. "Grow garden," he said. Thomas felt that familiar warm feeling in his chest. His son was kind, even to worms. Eliza was raising him right. Speaking of Eliza, she appeared in the doorway with flour dusting her apron and a smile on her face. The morning sun caught the gold highlights in her brown hair, and Thomas thought once again how lucky he was. The scared, broken woman who had collapsed by his well was gone. In her place was someone strong and happy and whole. "Breakfast is ready," she called. "And Matthew, you need to wash those hands before you touch anything in my clean kitchen." Matthew ran to the water pump, chattering about his worm discovery. Thomas followed more slowly, enjoying the sight of his family going about their normal morning routine. 2 years had given them this ordinary happiness that felt extraordinary because of everything they survived to get here. The town had accepted them completely. No one asked questions about Matthew's early arrival or about Eliza's past. They were just the Hartwell family, Thomas, Eliza, and little Matthew. The blacksmith always saved candy for Matthew when they went to town. Mrs. Chin at the general store let him help sort buttons. Even old grumpy Mr. Wallace smiled when Matthew waved at him from the wagon. Life was good, safe, peaceful. That's exactly when danger decided to knock on their door. The letter arrived with Jim Morrison, the traveling postman, who brought mail to all the far-flung farms and ranches. Jim usually stayed for coffee and gossip, but today he looked uncomfortable, nervous, like he was carrying something he didn't want to deliver. "Morning, Thomas," Jim said, but his usual cheerful voice was missing. "Got something here from Mrs. Hartwell." Eliza came out to greet Jim, wiping her hands on her apron. "How nice. I wasn't expecting any mail." Jim handed her a folded paper with black wax, sealing it shut. "Came through the main post office in town. Fellow who sent it was asking lots of questions about folks living out this way." Thomas felt a cold finger of worry touch his spine. What kind of questions? Questions about families, new arrivals, especially about women and children. Jim's face was serious now. Town folks didn't much like his attitude. Something about him felt wrong. Eliza stared at the letter in her hands like it might bite her. The black wax seal had been pressed with some kind of religious symbol, a cross surrounded by words too small to read. "Who sent it?" Thomas asked. "Called himself Reverend Caldwell," Jim replied. "Said he was looking for lost members of his flock." The letter fell from Eliza's hands like she'd been burned. Thomas caught it before it hit the ground, but not before he saw how white her face had gone. All the color drained away, leaving her looking like she might faint. "Eliza?" Thomas reached for her arm, but she stepped back. "It's him," she whispered. "He found us." Matthew, sensing something was wrong, stopped playing and moved closer to his mother. His little hand reached up to grab her skirt. "Mama sad?" he asked in his small voice. Eliza picked him up and held him tight, like she was afraid someone might steal him away. "Mama's okay, sweetheart, just surprised by the letter." But Thomas could see she was lying. She was terrified. Jim Morrison looked back and forth between them, clearly realizing he'd delivered bad news. "Should I tell the sheriff about this fellow?" "Like I said, nobody in town trusted him much." "Yes," Thomas said quickly. "Tell Sheriff Williams that we might have trouble coming our way." After Jim rode off, Thomas opened the letter with shaking hands. The words inside were written in fancy handwriting, all proper and polite on the surface. But underneath the pretty language was something ugly and threatening. The letter talked about spiritual duty and reclaiming lost souls. It mentioned a wayward woman and an innocent child who needed proper guidance. But the worst part was the last line. I will be visiting soon to collect what belongs to God's work. Thomas read it twice, his anger growing with each word. This man was claiming ownership of his family, his wife, his son. What does he want? Eliza asked, even though she already knew. He wants to take you away, both of you. Thomas folded the letter and put it in his pocket. But that's not going to happen. Matthew looked up at his parents with worried eyes. He was too young to understand the words, but he could feel the fear and anger in the air around him. Nobody take Mama, he said firmly. Nobody take Matthew. Thomas knelt down to his son's level. That's right, buddy. This is our home, our family, and nobody is going to change that. But even as he said the words, Thomas was already planning where to hide Eliza and Matthew if trouble came, how to defend the house, which neighbors might help, which weapons to clean and load. The peaceful morning was over. The war was coming to them whether they wanted it or not. Eliza sat down heavily in her kitchen chair, still holding Matthew close. I thought we were safe, she said. I thought he would never find us. We are safe, Thomas promised. I won't let him hurt either of you. But safety, they all realized, was about to become something they'd have to fight for, rather than something they could simply enjoy. Outside, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the wind was starting to pick up. It felt like a warning of the battle ahead. The church bell rang 13 times instead of 12, and every soul in town knew something evil had arrived. Reverend Caldwell stepped off the morning stage with a carpet bag in one hand and a Bible in the other, his black coat making him look like a crow among the sparrows. Thomas sat on his horse at the edge of town, watching through the general store window as people gathered around the stranger. The Reverend's voice carried across the dusty street like honey poured over broken glass. Good people of Nebraska, Caldwell began, raising his arms wide. I come seeking a lost lamb who wandered from my flock. A young woman with dark hair, traveling with child, who may have forgotten her Christian duties. Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, leaned forward with hungry eyes. She loved gossip more than her own bread. What did this woman do, Reverend? She ran from God's plan, Caldwell replied, shaking his head sadly. Left our mission without permission, taking with her a child who needs proper guidance. I worry for both their souls. Thomas felt his stomach turn cold. The way Caldwell said, proper guidance, made it sound like a threat wrapped in prayer. Old Pete the blacksmith scratched his beard. Ain't seen nobody like that, Reverend. This is a small town. We remember. But young Billy Thompson, who delivered mail and loved to feel important, spoke up. Wait, there's that woman living out at the Hartwell place. She's got a little boy, maybe 2 years old. Thomas wanted to ride down and silence Billy forever, but moving now would only make things worse. Instead, he listened as Caldwell's eyes lit up like candles in a dark room. Hartwell, you say? The Reverend's smile could have cut steel. Perhaps I should pay this family a visit. As a man of God, it's my duty to check on lost souls. Thomas rode home faster than he'd ever ridden, his horse's hooves beating out a warning rhythm against the hard earth. He burst through the kitchen door to find Eliza teaching Matthew how to stack wooden blocks. He's here, Thomas said, breathing hard. The Reverend, in town, asking questions. Eliza's face went white as winter snow. Matthew looked up from his blocks, sensing the fear in the room without understanding it. Mama sad? The little boy asked, reaching his small arms toward Eliza. No, baby, she whispered, lifting him close. Mama's just thinking. Thomas knelt beside them both. We need to be ready. I'm going to ride to see Sheriff Williams tonight. We need official papers, something that proves Matthew belongs with us. What if that's not enough? Eliza's voice shook like leaves in a storm. Then we'll make it enough, Thomas promised. But first, we need the law on our side. That evening, Thomas found Sheriff Williams cleaning his rifle on the jailhouse porch. Williams was a good man who'd served in the war alongside Thomas. If anyone would listen to reason, it would be him. Evening, Tom, Williams said without looking up. Heard we got ourselves a visiting preacher. Seems like a righteous fellow. Seems like a snake to me, Thomas replied, settling into the chair beside his old friend. That man's not what he appears to be, Jake. Williams finally looked up, studying Thomas's face in the lamplight. You want to tell me why you think that? Thomas chose his words carefully. Let's just say he has an unhealthy interest in other people's families. Specifically, mine. Your family? Williams raised an eyebrow. Tom, you've been a bachelor for 5 years running. What family? I got married last week, Thomas said quietly, to Eliza. She's a good woman, Jake. Has a little boy who calls me Papa. We're happy. Williams set down his rifle. This wouldn't have anything to do with the woman that preacher's looking for, would it? Thomas met his friend's eyes steadily. Eliza's my wife now. Matthew's my son. Whatever happened before doesn't matter. What matters is keeping my family safe. Tom, Williams said slowly, if this preacher has legal claim to the woman or child, he doesn't. Thomas pulled out the marriage certificate he'd gotten from Judge Morrison the week before. This makes it legal. Eliza chose to marry me. Matthew chose to call me Papa. No preacher can change that. Williams examined the papers by lamplight. Everything looked proper and official. Well, this seems to settle things. I'll have a talk with Reverend Caldwell tomorrow. Let him know his search ends here. But as Thomas rode home under the star-filled sky, he couldn't shake the feeling that papers alone wouldn't stop a man like Caldwell. Some people took what they wanted, regardless of law or decency. Back at the ranch, he found Eliza sitting by the window, watching the road with Matthew sleeping in her arms. The sight of them waiting for him filled Thomas with a fierce protectiveness he'd never felt during the war. Everything all right? She asked softly. Will be, Thomas promised, though he made sure to check the locks on both doors before bed. Meanwhile, in town, Reverend Caldwell sat in his rented room above the Mercantile, writing letters by candlelight. His smile grew wider with each word he wrote. Soon, very soon, he would reclaim what belonged to him. The next morning brought news that made Thomas's blood run cold. Billy Thompson rode out to the ranch with a message from Sheriff Williams. Tom, Billy panted, sliding off his horse. The sheriff says to tell you that preacher's got legal papers. Says he's the girl's legal guardian, appointed by some court back east. Says the boy belongs in his custody. Thomas felt the world tilt sideways. What kind of papers? Don't know exactly, but they look official. Got seals and everything. Sheriff says he's real sorry, but the law's the law. After Billy left, Thomas found Eliza in the garden, pulling weeds with shaking hands, while Matthew played nearby with his wooden horse. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and the hope in her eyes nearly broke his heart. What did the sheriff say? She asked. Thomas knelt down beside her, taking her dirt-stained hands in his. We're going to fight this, he said firmly. Whatever papers that man has, we'll find a way around them. You're my wife now. Matthew's my son. Nobody's taking that away from us. But even as he spoke the words, Thomas could see Caldwell's shadow growing longer across their small piece of happiness. The real battle was just beginning. That man ain't leaving town, Mrs. Henderson announced to anyone who would listen, her voice carrying across the general store like a bell. Says he's got God's work to finish here. Thomas heard her words as he loaded supplies into his wagon, and his hands tightened on the flour sack he was lifting. 3 days had passed since Caldwell's arrival, and the preacher had made himself comfortable like a tick on a dog. Course he's staying, replied Frank Morrison, the store owner. Good to have a holy man around. Been too long since we had proper preaching in this town. But old Pete the blacksmith shook his grizzled head. Something wrong about that fellow. Seen his type during the war. Pretty words hiding ugly intentions. Thomas appreciated Pete's support, but he could count the supporters on one hand. Most folks seemed charmed by Caldwell's smooth talking and fancy Bible verses. At home, the worry was eating at them like rust on iron. Eliza jumped at every unexpected sound, and Matthew sensed the tension even though he couldn't understand it. The little boy stayed closer to his parents, clinging to Thomas's leg when he worked and refusing to play outside alone. Papa, Why Mama scared? Matthew asked one morning, his green eyes wide with confusion. Thomas knelt down to the boy's level, choosing his words carefully. Sometimes grown-ups have to deal with difficult people, but Papa's here to keep you and Mama safe. Bad man coming? Matthew whispered. Not if I can help it, Thomas promised, lifting his son into a fierce hug. But keeping that promise was getting harder every day. Caldwell had rented the room above the Mercantile and started holding evening services in the town square. His sermons drew crowds, especially the lonely widows and impressionable young folks who hung on his every word. Thomas attended one of these gatherings, standing in the back shadows to observe. Caldwell's voice rang out clear and strong in the evening air. Brothers and sisters, the preacher called, raising his hands toward the darkening sky. We must be vigilant against those who would corrupt the innocent. Children belong in righteous homes, not with those who mock God's sacred laws. The crowd murmured agreement, not understanding the hidden meaning behind his words. But Thomas heard the threat buried in the sermon, aimed directly at his family. After the service, several townspeople approached Thomas with questions. That your wife he's talking about, Tom? Asked Jim Bradley, the livery stable owner. My wife is Eliza Hartwell, Thomas replied firmly. She's a good woman and a good mother. Anyone who says different is welcome to discuss it with me. Bradley backed down at the steel in Thomas's voice, but Thomas knew the questions would keep coming. The real trouble started when Caldwell began visiting homes during the day, offering spiritual guidance and asking careful questions about the Hartwell family. Thomas learned about these visits from Sarah Collins, the seamstress who lived alone and valued honesty above politeness. He came by yesterday, Sarah told Thomas when he stopped by her shop, asking about your Eliza. Wanted to know how long she'd been here, what her previous circumstances were. I told him it wasn't his business, but he kept pressing. What did you tell him? Thomas asked. Nothing useful, Sarah replied with a sniff. Man gives me the shivers. Too many teeth in his smile, if you know what I mean. Thomas did know. Predators often smiled the widest when they were hunting. That evening, Thomas called a family meeting around their kitchen table. Matthew played with his wooden blocks nearby while the adults talked in low voices. We need to be prepared for anything, Thomas said, his voice serious but calm. Caldwell's not giving up easily. He's working to turn the town against us. Eliza's hands shook as she poured coffee. What if he succeeds? What if people believe his lies? Then we'll prove them wrong, Thomas replied. But we need to be smart about it. No more going to town alone, Eliza. And Matthew stays close to the house at all times. I feel like a prisoner in my own home, Eliza whispered. Thomas reached across the table to take her hand. It's temporary. Once people see what he really is, they'll understand. But Thomas wasn't sure he believed his own words. Caldwell was clever, wrapping his poison in pretty packages that fooled good people. The breaking point came on Thursday afternoon. Thomas had ridden to the far pasture to check on sick cattle, leaving Eliza and Matthew at home with strict instructions to stay inside. When he returned 2 hours later, he found Caldwell's black horse tied to his fence post. Thomas's blood turned to ice water in his veins. He approached the house quietly, hearing voices through the open kitchen window. Caldwell's smooth tone mixed with Eliza's frightened responses, and underneath it all, Matthew's confused crying. Thomas burst through the front door to find a scene that made his vision go red around the edges. Caldwell stood too close to Eliza, who had backed against the kitchen counter with Matthew pressed behind her like she was trying to shield him with her own body. Get away from my family, Thomas said, his voice deadly quiet. Caldwell turned slowly, that snake oil smile spreading across his face. Ah, the protective husband returns. How touching. Papa! Matthew cried, trying to run to Thomas, but Eliza held him back, afraid to move away from the wall. You're not welcome here, Thomas said, his hand moving to the rifle he'd grabbed from beside the door. I'm doing God's work, Caldwell replied, his pale eyes gleaming with something that wasn't holy. This woman was promised to my mission. The child belongs under proper Christian guidance, not with a man pretending to be his father. I don't pretend anything, Thomas shot back. Matthew is my son in every way that matters. Caldwell laughed, a sound like breaking glass. We both know that's not true. The boy carries the seed of a righteous man. He belongs with those who can teach him proper values. Thomas felt the truth hit him like a physical blow. Caldwell wasn't just claiming Matthew because of some legal papers. The man was claiming to be the boy's real father. You're lying, Eliza whispered, but her face had gone pale as moonlight. Am I? Caldwell asked, his smile growing wider. Look at the boy's eyes, woman. Look at his hands. Tell me you don't see the resemblance. Thomas looked at Matthew, really looked, and felt his world begin to crumble. The boy did have Caldwell's pale eyes, now that Thomas thought about it, and his hands were long and thin like the preacher's. But then, Matthew broke free from his mother's grasp and ran straight to Thomas, wrapping his small arms around Thomas's legs. Papa home, the boy cried joyfully. Papa save us from bad man. In that moment, Thomas understood something important. Blood might determine who helped create a child, but love determined who raised him. Matthew chose Thomas as his father every single day. Get out, Thomas said again, raising the rifle, and don't come back. Caldwell's smile faded into something cold and dangerous. This isn't over, Hartwell. I'll have what belongs to me, one way or another. The law will support a father's rights over a stranger's claims. The preacher left, but his threat hung in the air like smoke from a poisoned fire. Thomas knew the real battle was just beginning, and everything he loved hung in the balance. Fire roared through the night like an angry beast. Thomas jolted awake to orange light dancing on his bedroom walls and the terrible sound of horses screaming in fear. The barn! He shouted, leaping from bed. Through the window, flames reached toward the stars like giant fingers. His prize stallion, Mercury, reared inside the burning building while smoke poured from every crack in the wooden walls. Eliza sat up fast, her heart pounding. Where's Matthew? They both turned toward the child's small bed, empty. Matthew! Eliza's scream cut through the roar of fire. She stumbled toward the main room while Thomas grabbed his boots. Outside, sparks fell like deadly snow on their roof. In the kitchen, a nightmare waited. Reverend Caldwell stood near the back door, holding 2-year-old Matthew tight against his black coat. The little boy's face was red from crying, his small fist pushing against the man's chest. Mama! Matthew sobbed, reaching toward Eliza with desperate arms. Let him go. Eliza's voice shook, but her hand stayed steady as she picked up the big kitchen knife. Now. Caldwell smiled, but his eyes looked crazy in the firelight coming through the windows. You ran from God's plan, child, but God always finds his lost sheep. You're no man of God, Eliza said. The knife glinted as she stepped closer. You're a monster who hurts women. Careful with your words. Caldwell's grip on Matthew got tighter. The boy whimpered. This child needs proper raising, not from a fallen woman and her protector. Thomas burst through the front door, covered in soot and ash. His shirt was torn and his hands were black from fighting the fire. Behind him, orange light painted the whole world in the color of danger. Put my son down. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of thunder before a storm. In his hands, his old army rifle pointed straight at Caldwell's heart. Caldwell laughed, a sound like glass breaking on stone. Your son? We both know the truth about this child's real father. I know the truth, Thomas said, stepping into the room. Matthew is mine. Has been since the day he was born. Blood doesn't make a father, love does. The fire outside grew louder. Pieces of burning wood crashed down from the barn roof. Through the kitchen window, they could see their neighbors running toward the flames with buckets of water. But the real battle was happening right here, in this small room where a family's future hung by a thread. You can't stop what's meant to be, Caldwell said, his face twisted with anger. I have rights, legal rights. You have nothing, Eliza said. She moved closer, the knife still in her hand. I know what you did to other women. Mrs. Patterson told me about her sister in Kansas. You left her with nothing but shame and a baby she couldn't feed. For the first time, fear flickered in Caldwell's eyes. That's different. No, Thomas said. It's exactly the same. You're a wolf in sheep's clothing, and everyone's starting to see your teeth. Matthew squirmed harder in Caldwell's arms. Papa, Papa, he cried, his little hands reaching toward Thomas. The word hit Caldwell like a slap. His grip loosened just enough, just for 1 second. Eliza moved like lightning. The knife slashed down, cutting deep into Caldwell's wrist. He screamed and dropped Matthew, who tumbled toward the floor. Thomas dove forward, catching his son before he hit the ground. Behind them, Caldwell fell against the wall, clutching his bleeding arm and cursing. It's over, Thomas said, standing with Matthew safe in his arms. Sheriff Williams is already on his way. Half the town saw you sneaking around our property tonight. Blood dripped from Caldwell's wound onto the wooden floor. You don't understand. I have influence. Money. People will believe me over a whore and a broken-down soldier. Maybe, Eliza said, wiping the knife clean on her nightgown. But they'll believe what they see with their own eyes. Outside, voices called through the night. Thomas, Eliza, are you safe? Sheriff Williams had arrived with a dozen townspeople, all carrying lanterns and worried faces. Caldwell looked toward the door, then at the blood on his hands, then at the family standing together against him. For the first time, he seemed to understand that his power was just an illusion built on fear. This isn't finished, he whispered. Yes, Thomas said, bouncing Matthew gently to calm the boy's tears. It is. The sheriff stepped through the door just as Caldwell tried to run. 2 strong farmers grabbed his arms before he could reach the darkness outside. Found him sneaking around the barn about an hour ago, Sheriff Williams said, pulling out his handcuffs. Figured he might be up to no good. Looks like I was right. As they dragged Caldwell away, he kept shouting about his rights and God's will. But his words got swallowed by the sound of the fire dying down and the voices of neighbors working together to save what they could. Thomas, Eliza, and Matthew stood in their kitchen, holding each other tight. Through the window, the first light of dawn painted the sky pink and gold. The barn was gone, but they were still here. Still together, still a family. Is the bad man gone? Matthew asked in his small voice. Yes, Eliza whispered, kissing the top of his head. He's gone forever. But even as she spoke the words, she wondered if the scars Caldwell left behind would ever truly heal. 6 months later, the sound of hammers rang across the prairie like a song of hope. Thomas wiped sweat from his face and smiled as he watched his 3-year-old son try to help build the new barn. Papa, I'm strong like you, Matthew declared, picking up a nail that was bigger than his tiny finger. You sure are, buddy. Thomas ruffled the boy's dark hair. But maybe let me handle the sharp things for now. The whole town had come to help rebuild. Even Mrs. Henderson, who used to whisper about that woman behind her fan, now brought fresh bread and kind words. Amazing how facing down a real monster could change people's minds about who deserved their friendship. Thomas, called Jim Morrison, the trader who used to look at Eliza in ways that made Thomas's hands curl into fists. Now Jim treated her with the respect due to any neighbor's wife. We need you to check these support beams. As Thomas climbed up to examine the wooden frame, he felt eyes watching him. Eliza stood in the doorway of their house, one hand resting on her growing belly, where their second child lived and grew. This baby was different from Matthew. Wanted, planned, made from love instead of fear. Looking good, she called out, and Thomas couldn't tell if she meant the barn or something else. Either way, he felt his chest fill with pride. Dr. Patterson rode up on his old gray horse, medical bag bouncing against his saddle. Afternoon, folks. Thought I'd stop by and check on our expecting mother. Eliza disappeared inside with the doctor while Thomas climbed down from the barn frame. Through the window, he could hear her laughing at something Dr. Patterson said. That sound still surprised him sometimes, how easily joy came to her now, like water flowing after a drought. Mr. Hartwell? A small voice made him turn. Lucy Chen, the 8-year-old daughter of the new family from California, stood holding a folded paper. My mama sent this for you. Thomas opened the note and smiled. Mrs. Chen was asking if he could teach her husband about raising cattle. More and more folks were moving to Nebraska, and somehow Thomas had become the man they came to for advice about surviving on the prairie. Tell your mama we'll be happy to help, he said, handing Lucy a penny for her trouble. As the little girl skipped away, Sheriff Williams rode up with news written all over his face.
I'm sorry to interrupt you right here, but if you're enjoying this story thus far, please consider to subscribe to our channel so that you can enjoy so many more in the future. And by the way, don't hesitate to like the video as well, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Now enjoy the rest of the story.
Got word from the territorial prison, Williams said, climbing down from his horse. Caldwell won't be bothering anyone for a long time. Turns out there were other women willing to speak up once they heard he was locked up. 5 more came forward from different towns. Thomas felt something heavy lift from his shoulders. Good. They deserve justice. There's more. Williams lowered his voice. Judge Morrison, Jim's uncle, the one who handles adoptions, he wants to make things official. Says any man who'd stand up to a monster like Caldwell deserves to have his family protected by law. Before Thomas could ask what that meant, Matthew came running over with his arms full of wood shavings. Papa, look what I made. The boy had somehow turned the shavings into the shape of a horse. That's beautiful, son. Thomas knelt down to Matthew's level. What are you going to name your horse? Thunder, Matthew announced, like the storm that brought Mama to us. Sometimes children said things that cut right to the truth. Thomas glanced toward the house where Dr. Patterson was finishing his examination of Eliza. She had come to them in a storm, scared and broken. Now she was the heart that made their house a home. Mr. Hartwell! Dr. Patterson's voice carried excitement as he stepped onto the porch. Everything looks perfect. The baby should arrive right around Christmas time. Christmas. Thomas tried to imagine their little family with another child, another voice calling him Papa. The thought made him smile so wide his face hurt. That evening, after the neighbors had gone home and Matthew was asleep in his bed, Thomas and Eliza sat on their new porch swing. The old one had burned with the barn, but this one was bigger, built to hold a growing family. Dr. Patterson says it might be a girl this time, Eliza said, her hand moving in small circles on her belly. What would you like to name her? Thomas asked. Hope, Eliza said without hesitation. I want to name her Hope. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars come out over their rebuilt land. In the distance, a coyote howled, but it didn't sound lonely anymore. It sounded like it was calling to its pack, reminding them that they belonged together. Thomas, Eliza said quietly, Sheriff Williams told me about the adoption papers. Are you sure you want to make it legal? Once your name is on those documents, Matthew will be your son, in the eyes of the law, forever. Thomas thought about all the ways a person could become a father. Some men got the title by accident. Others earned it through sleepless nights and patient teaching, through protecting small dreams and wiping away tears. I've been his papa since the day he was born, Thomas said. The papers will just make it official. A shooting star streaked across the sky, bright and brief and beautiful. Make a wish, Eliza whispered. Thomas closed his eyes and wished for more evenings like this one, peaceful and full of love, with his family safe beside him and the future stretching out like an unwritten story. When he opened his eyes, Matthew was standing in the doorway in his nightshirt, rubbing sleepy eyes. I had a bad dream, the boy said. Come here, buddy. Thomas lifted Matthew onto his lap. What was it about? The bad man came back and took you away. Eliza reached over to stroke Matthew's hair. That was just a dream, sweetheart. The bad man is gone forever, and Papa isn't going anywhere. Promise? Matthew asked. Promise, Thomas said, meaning it with every piece of his heart. As they carried their son back to bed, Thomas thought about the strange ways life could surprise you. 3 years ago, he'd been a man living alone, talking to his horses because they were the only listeners he had. Now he was a husband, a father, and soon to be a father again. Not bad for a man the world had forgotten. Not bad at all. Blood stained the white sheets like spilled wine, and Eliza's screams cut through the Christmas Eve blizzard like a knife through silk. Thomas paced the kitchen floor below, his boots wearing a path in the wood, while Dr. Patterson's grim voice drifted down from upstairs. "Something's wrong," Mrs. Patterson whispered as she hurried past with more hot water. "Very wrong." Thomas felt his stomach drop like a stone down a well. For 18 hours, Eliza had been fighting to bring their second child into the world. But the baby seemed determined to stay hidden, safe from the cold Nebraska winter of 1870. Upstairs, another scream tore through the house. Matthew stirred in his small bed by the fireplace, his 3-year-old face scrunched with worry even in sleep. "Thomas," Dr. Patterson called down, "I need to speak with you. Now." Thomas climbed the stairs with legs that felt like wet rope. In their bedroom, Eliza lay pale as the snow outside, her dark hair plastered to her head with sweat. Her green eyes found his, and he saw fear there that matched his own. "The baby's cord is wrapped around its neck," Dr. Patterson said quietly. "I've tried everything I know, but," he shook his head, "we're losing them both." The words hit Thomas like a cannonball to the chest. During the war, he'd watched good men die from wounds that couldn't be healed, but this was different. This was his family slipping away while he stood helpless. "There has to be something," Thomas said. "Someone who knows more than we do." Mrs. Patterson looked up from changing bloody towels. "There is Gray Dove, the old Pawnee woman who lives by Willow Creek. Her people say she can help when regular medicine fails." Thomas looked out the window at the blizzard raging beyond the glass. Snow fell so thick he couldn't see past their barn. Willow Creek was 5 miles away through open prairie where a man could freeze to death in minutes. "I'll go," he said. "Thomas!" "No." Eliza's voice was weak but determined. "The storm will kill you before you get halfway there." "Maybe," Thomas replied, pulling on his heaviest coat. "But staying here will definitely kill you. And I'd rather die trying than live, knowing I gave up." He saddled Mercury in the barn, talking to the old horse like a friend. "I know it's crazy, boy, but we've done crazy things before and lived to tell about it." Mercury's breath made white clouds in the freezing air as Thomas led him into the storm. The wind hit them like a living thing, trying to push them back toward the warm barn. Snow stung Thomas's face and hands, but he urged Mercury forward into the white darkness. Navigation became a guessing game. Thomas followed fence lines when he could find them, used his compass when the snow cleared enough to see it, and mostly trusted Mercury's instincts to find the way. Twice they got turned around completely. Once they nearly walked into a frozen creek that could have killed them both. But somehow, after what felt like hours of fighting through the blizzard, smoke appeared through the swirling snow. Gray Dove's cabin sat beside Willow Creek like a lighthouse in a storm. The old woman opened her door before Thomas could knock, as if she'd been watching for him through the white curtain of snow. "Your woman fights to bring life into the world," she said in her careful English, "but the child's spirit is confused. It does not know whether to stay or go." "Can you help her?" Thomas asked, shaking snow from his coat. Gray Dove's weathered face showed no emotion. As she gathered small bundles of herbs, carved stones, and other items Thomas didn't recognize. "The spirits will decide. But we must give them reason to choose life." The ride back nearly killed them both. Mercury stumbled twice in deep drifts, and Thomas had to dismount to lead the horse around a fallen tree. His hands and feet went numb with cold, and ice formed in his beard. But Gray Dove sat behind him on the horse, chanting softly in Pawnee, her voice somehow cutting through the wind. "She still lives," Gray Dove said as they approached the house. "I can feel her spirit fighting." Inside, Dr. Patterson looked up from Eliza's bedside with amazement and relief. "I don't know how you made it through that storm, but thank God you did." Gray Dove moved to Eliza's side with quiet authority. She placed warm stones on Eliza's swollen belly and began a low chant that seemed to fill the room with invisible energy. Then she mixed herbs into steaming water, creating tea that smelled like prairie flowers and morning rain. "Drink," she told Eliza. "This will help the little one remember why it wants to live." For the next hour, nothing seemed to change. Eliza sipped the tea between waves of pain while Gray Dove continued her chanting. Dr. Patterson checked and rechecked, but the baby remained stubbornly stuck. Then, just as Thomas began to lose hope, Eliza's eyes went wide with surprise. "Something's different," she whispered. "I can feel the baby moving. Really moving." Dr. Patterson examined her again, his tired face suddenly bright with amazement. "The cord! It's loosened! The baby's turning!" What happened next felt like watching a miracle unfold. Hope, Catherine Hartwell, entered the world with a cry that could wake the dead, her tiny fists waving as if she was celebrating her own victory over death. "She's beautiful," Dr. Patterson announced, placing the baby in Eliza's arms. "Perfect in every way." Thomas looked at his daughter for the first time and felt something break open in his chest. She had Eliza's green eyes and a stubborn expression that reminded him of himself. When she wrapped her tiny fingers around his thumb, he knew he'd ride through 1,000 blizzards to keep her safe. "How can I ever repay you?" he asked Gray Dove, who was quietly packing her herbs away. The old woman smiled. "When the snow melts, bring your family to visit. My grandson Joseph needs to learn that courage comes in all colors." As Christmas morning dawned clear and bright, Matthew woke to discover he had a baby sister. He approached the bed where Eliza held Hope with the careful steps of someone approaching something precious and fragile. "She's so tiny," he whispered. "Does she know I'm her big brother?" "She knows," Eliza said, adjusting Hope so Matthew could see her better. "And she's going to need you to teach her everything about being brave and kind." Matthew's chest puffed out with pride at this important responsibility. "I'll protect her forever, Mama. Nobody will ever hurt her while I'm around." Thomas watched his son gently stroke Hope's tiny hand and felt his heart overflow with love and gratitude. Outside, the blizzard had ended, leaving the world buried in clean white snow. Inside, their family was complete and whole. But as he held his new daughter, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of their challenges. The frontier gave families beautiful moments, but it also tested them in ways no one could predict. Corn stalks stood dead in the fields like tiny skeletons, their brown leaves rustling with sounds that reminded Thomas of old bones breaking. Summer 1872 had arrived like the devil's own furnace, turning their green paradise into a dusty graveyard where nothing grew and hope died a little more each day. "Papa, why did God stop sending rain?" 4-year-old Matthew asked, kicking at dirt so hard it had cracked into puzzle pieces. Thomas wiped sweat from his forehead and tried to think of an answer that wouldn't frighten his son. The truth was simple and terrible. No rain meant no crops meant no money, and no money meant losing everything they'd built together. "Sometimes the sky gets tired," Thomas said finally, "but it always remembers how to rain again." Baby Hope, now 18 months old and walking everywhere on unsteady legs, picked up a handful of dust and threw it in the air like confetti. She giggled as the brown particles drifted down on her dark curls, too young to understand that their world was slowly dying of thirst. Eliza appeared in the kitchen doorway, bouncing little David on her hip. Their third child, born just 6 months ago, seemed perfectly content despite the heat and worry that surrounded him. Sometimes babies were blessed with ignorance that adults envied. "Mr. Jameson is coming up the road," Eliza said quietly. "He's got papers in his hand." Thomas felt his stomach twist like a rope pulled too tight. The banker had been patient for months, but patience didn't pay bills or feed families. They owed $300 for the land and equipment, money that should have come from selling wheat and corn that now lay dead in the fields. By noon, the temperature had climbed past 100 degrees for the 15th day in a row. Mr. Jameson arrived in his fancy buggy, his round face red as a beet, and his white shirt soaked with sweat. "Terrible business, this drought," Jameson said, climbing down carefully from his buggy. Worst I've seen in 20 years of banking. They gathered around the kitchen table where Eliza served water that tasted of dust and desperation. Through the window, Thomas could see his cattle standing in whatever shade they could find, their ribs beginning to show through their hides. I'll speak plainly, Hartwell, Jameson said, mopping his forehead with a handkerchief that had seen better days. The bank needs payment. Half the farmers in the county are failing. We can't carry everyone forever. How long do we have? Thomas asked, though he dreaded the answer. 60 days. If you can't make a substantial payment by then, we'll have no choice but to foreclose. 60 days. Thomas calculated rapidly in his head. The well had dropped to 20 feet and was still falling. Their savings had already gone to buying expensive feed for the animals. Even if it rained tomorrow, nothing would grow fast enough to save them. There might be another option, Jameson continued, pulling official-looking papers from his leather satchel. The Union Pacific Railroad is hiring experienced men for dangerous work, track laying through hostile territory. $45 a month, plus meals and transportation. Eliza's face went pale as milk. Railroad work meant months away from home, living in rough camps with men who settled arguments with guns and fists. It meant leaving her alone with 3 small children in a world that was already too hard for strong men. Think it over, Jameson said, standing to leave. But don't think too long. Opportunity doesn't wait for anyone. That night, Thomas walked out to the barn where Mercury nickered softly in greeting. The old warhorse was getting gray around the muzzle, but his eyes still held intelligence and loyalty that human beings often lack. What do you think, old friend? Thomas asked, stroking the horse's neck. Should I abandon my family to save my family? Mercury had no answers, but Thomas could hear his own heart beating out the rhythm of impossible choices. Stay home and watch them lose everything. Leave home and maybe never see them again. The next morning brought visitors that nobody expected. Jim Morrison rode up, leading a small parade of familiar faces. Pete Hansen, the blacksmith, Carlos Mendez from the general store, and most surprisingly, Joseph Running Bear, Gray Dove's grandson who worked as a translator for the territorial government. We've got a proposition, Jim announced, climbing down from his dusty horse. Every farmer within 50 miles is facing the same demon. What if we stopped fighting alone and started fighting together? They crowded around the kitchen table, while Eliza served coffee that was mostly chicory and hope. The children played quietly in the corner, sensing that important grown-up business was happening. Joseph here knows things about water that we never learned in school, Pete said, nodding toward the young Pawnee man. His people have been farming this land since before our grandfathers were born. Joseph's dark eyes were serious as he spread a hand-drawn map on the table. There is a river beneath this earth that white men cannot see. My grandfather taught me to read the signs when I was just a boy learning to walk. What kind of signs? Thomas asked, leaning forward with interest. The way morning mist gathers in certain places, how some grass stays green longer than others, the feel of soil beneath your feet when you know how to listen. Joseph pointed to spots on his map that corresponded to their land and their neighbors' farms. Here, and especially here, the underground river runs strong and true. But how do we reach it? Carlos asked. We'd need to dig channels across miles of prairie. That's where cooperation comes in, Jim said. I've got horses and wagons for moving dirt. Pete can forge the metal tools we need. Carlos has shovels and rope in his store. Thomas has the strongest back in the county and land that sits right over the best water source. Thomas felt hope flickering like a candle flame in dark wind. What about equipment cost? Materials? Time? We trade labor instead of money, Pete suggested. You help me dig irrigation ditches to my farm. I'll make metal pipes for your water system. Everyone contributes what they can. Everyone benefits from the result. Eliza looked up from bouncing baby David. What about your own families? Your own problems? That's the beautiful part, Carlos said. If we connect all our farms with water channels, we either all survive together or all fail together. But failing together still beats failing alone. Little Matthew looked up from his wooden blocks. Papa, are we going to lose our house? Thomas knelt down to his son's level and saw the worry in those young eyes. Not if we can help it, buddy, but it's going to take harder work than we've ever done before. I can work hard, Matthew said seriously. I'm almost 5 years old. That afternoon, Joseph walked Thomas across their land, pointing out subtle signs that revealed where water flowed far beneath their feet, a particular type of buffalo grass that stayed greener longer, the way morning dew formed in specific patterns, how certain areas of soil felt different under their boots, softer, more alive. Your grandfather really taught you all this? Thomas asked. His grandfather taught him, and his grandfather's grandfather taught him, Joseph replied. The earth keeps its secrets, but it will share them with those who know how to ask politely. As the sun began to set, painting their dusty fields in shades of gold and amber, Thomas looked out over land that had seemed dead and worthless just hours before. Now he could imagine it green again, fed by hidden water and tended by neighbors working together. You really think this can work? He asked Joseph. The young man smiled. My people have a saying, when the surface world fails, look deeper. The earth always provides for those willing to dig. Sometimes the answer to impossible problems was simpler than anyone expected. Sometimes it just required looking at old challenges with new eyes. Thomas just hoped they had enough time to prove that cooperation could triumph over catastrophe. The sound of children's laughter drifted through the morning air like music, but 5-year-old Matthew could only watch from his bedroom window as other kids walked past their house toward the new schoolhouse in town. His small hands pressed against the glass, leaving fingerprints that Eliza would later wipe away with a heavy heart. Why can't I go with them, Mama? Matthew asked for what felt like the 100th time that September morning in 1872. Eliza set down her sewing and joined him at the window. Down the dusty road, she could see Tommy Peterson swinging his lunch pail, Sarah Williams carrying her new slate, and Joseph Running Bear walking quietly behind the group with his head down. All of them heading toward knowledge while her son stayed home. The walk is very long, sweetheart, she said, the same answer she'd given every day for 2 weeks. But Matthew was getting older, getting smarter, and simple answers weren't enough anymore. Joseph walks farther than me, and he gets to go. His grandmother told me so when we visited last week. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his face grim from the conversation he'd had in town the day before. Come here, son. Let's talk about this properly. They gathered around the kitchen table, where baby Hope played with wooden spoons, her cheerful babbling a sharp contrast to the serious mood. Thomas had rehearsed this conversation in his mind, but the words still felt like rocks in his throat. I went to see Mrs. Whitfield yesterday, he began. The new teacher from Boston. Matthew's eyes lit up with hope. What did she say? Can I start next week? She said. Thomas paused, looking for words a 5-year-old could understand without crushing his spirit entirely. She said some of the other parents have concerns about you joining the class. What kind of concerns? Eliza asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. They think Matthew might be disruptive. They have questions about his background. Background. Such a clean word for such an ugly truth. 3 families had already threatened to pull their children out if that boy was allowed to attend. Mrs. Whitfield, facing the loss of half her students and her income, had politely but firmly declined Matthew's enrollment. Matthew's young face scrunched with confusion. But I'm not disruptive. I sit quietly when you read stories. I help with chores. I'm nice to everyone. You are all those things, Thomas said, kneeling beside his son's chair. But sometimes people make decisions based on fear instead of facts. What are they afraid of? Matthew pressed. Eliza and Thomas exchanged glances over their son's head. How could they explain that some people still whispered about Reverend Caldwell? That gossip had twisted the truth until some folks believed Matthew carried his biological father's bad blood, that others simply couldn't accept a family that didn't fit their narrow idea of normal. They're afraid of what they don't understand, Eliza said finally. But that's their problem, not yours. So I can't go to school? Ever? The heartbreak in Matthew's voice made Thomas's chest ache. Not that school, but maybe we can make our own school, right here. Over the following weeks, Their kitchen table became Matthew's classroom. Eliza taught him letters using recipe cards and stories from her few precious books. Thomas showed him numbers through measuring grain and calculating distances between fence posts. Hope contributed by trying to eat the chalk and scribbling on slate boards with her chubby fingers. Matthew proved to be a remarkably quick learner. Within a month, he was reading simple sentences and writing his own name in careful letters. But despite his progress, Eliza noticed him growing quieter during the hours when other children passed by their house. "He's lonely," she told Thomas one evening as they watched Matthew play alone with his wooden toys. "Children need other children to learn from and play with." "I know," Thomas replied, "but what choice do we have? The whole town isn't going to change their minds overnight." The answer came from an unexpected source. On a crisp October morning, Singing Crow appeared at their door with an offer that would change everything. "My grandson Joseph tells me your Matthew is very bright," she said in her careful English, each word chosen with precision. "Joseph struggles with reading English words. Your son needs practice with our language and customs. Perhaps they could teach each other." Matthew practically vibrated with excitement. Could I really learn Pawnee words and hunting signs and how to read animal tracks? "All those things and more," Singing Crow promised. "My people believe wisdom grows best when different minds work together." The arrangement began immediately. 3 mornings a week, Joseph came to their house for English lessons. 3 afternoons a week, Matthew walked to the Pawnee camp by Willow Creek for traditional instruction. Both boys flourished under this exchange, becoming as close as blood brothers. Joseph taught Matthew to identify edible plants, read weather signs and cloud formations, and move silently through tall grass. Matthew helped Joseph with English pronunciation, arithmetic, and the strange customs of white settlers. Together, they created a friendship that bridged 2 worlds. But their unusual education sparked new problems in town. "It's bad enough that woman is raising a child of questionable parentage," Mrs. Henderson declared loudly at the general store. "Now she's letting him run wild with Indians too. Mark my words, no good will come of this mixing." "Joseph is a smart, respectful boy," Eliza replied calmly, though her hands shook as she counted out coins for flour. "And Matthew is learning things no traditional school could teach." "Traditional schools teach proper values," Mrs. Henderson huffed. "Not heathen customs and savage ways." Other conversations weren't as polite. Thomas overheard men at the blacksmith shop questioning his judgment. Wondering aloud if Matthew might grow up confused about his place in the world, some suggested the boy needed proper masculine guidance instead of Indian nonsense. The tensions came to a head on a cold November afternoon. Thomas was loading supplies into his wagon when he heard shouting from behind the mercantile building. He dropped his rope and ran toward the noise, finding Matthew and Joseph surrounded by 4 older boys, including Tommy Peterson and Billy Henderson. "Half-breed freak," Tommy was yelling, his face red with borrowed anger. "My daddy says your real father was a crazy preacher who hurt your mama." Matthew's small fists were clenched, his whole body trembling with rage and confusion. Joseph stood beside him, ready to fight despite being outnumbered 2-1. "You don't know anything about my family," Matthew shouted back, his voice cracking with emotion. "Everyone knows the truth." Billy Henderson joined in, emboldened by his mother's opinions. "Your mama was a fallen woman, and you're just a bastard pretending to belong somewhere." The word hit Matthew like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, his face crumpling with hurt he was too young to understand but old enough to feel. Thomas stepped into the circle, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere. The bully suddenly looked very small and very scared. "Boys," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of barely controlled fury, "I believe you have somewhere else to be." 3 of the 4 scattered like startled rabbits, but Tommy Peterson, puffed up with his father's authority and his grandfather's position on the town council, held his ground. "My daddy says this half-breed shouldn't even be allowed in town," Tommy declared, pointing an accusing finger at Matthew. "Says he's gonna cause trouble mixing with Indians and acting like he belongs with decent folk." Thomas knelt down until he was eye level with the boy, his weathered hands clasped tightly to keep them from shaking with anger. "Tommy," he said, his voice deadly calm, "your daddy is entitled to his opinions, but if I ever hear you calling my son names again, your daddy and I are going to have a very serious conversation about respect and consequences. Do you understand me?" Tommy's bravado crumbled under Thomas's steady gaze. "Yes, sir," he whispered, then ran away as fast as his legs could carry him. As the dust settled, Thomas put his arms around both boys. Matthew was trying not to cry, while Joseph looked ready to hunt down the bullies and teach them better manners. "Are you both all right?" Thomas asked. "Papa," Matthew said, his voice small and broken. "What's a half-breed? And what did he mean about my real daddy being bad?" Thomas felt his heart crack. This was the conversation he'd hoped to postpone for several more years, but Matthew's tormentors had forced his hand. "Son," he said carefully, "there are some things about your early life that you're old enough to know now. When we get home, your mama and I will tell you the whole truth." That evening, by the warm glow of the fireplace, while Hope slept peacefully in her cradle, Thomas and Eliza told Matthew the story of Reverend Caldwell. They explained how Eliza had been traveling with a religious mission when the preacher violated her trust and hurt her, how she'd fled across the prairie, scared and pregnant, until she collapsed near their well, how Thomas had chosen to love them both from that very first day. Matthew listened without saying a word, his young face serious beyond his years. When they finished, silence filled the room except for the crackling of burning logs. "So you're not my real papa?" he finally asked. "I'm the most real papa you'll ever have," Thomas said firmly. "Blood doesn't make a family, son. Choice does. Love does. Every day I wake up and choose to be your father, and every day you choose to be my son." Matthew thought about this for a long moment, his intelligent eyes processing information that would challenge much older minds. "Tommy Peterson's daddy lives with him all the time," he said slowly, "but Tommy told Joseph that his daddy yells at him and hits him when he makes mistakes. You live with me, and you never yell or hit, even when I break things or forget my chores. I think I got the better deal." Thomas laughed despite the heaviness in his heart, pulling his son into a hug that lasted until Hope woke up demanding attention. Later, as Thomas tucked Matthew into bed, the boy had one final question that surprised them both. "Papa, when I grow up and have children, will I be able to choose my family like you did?" "Yes," Thomas promised without hesitation, "and I hope you choose people who love you exactly as you are, just like we do. Will you teach me how to choose good people?" "Every day," Thomas said, smoothing the covers around his son, "starting with choosing to be kind to others, especially those who are different from you." As Thomas closed Matthew's bedroom door, he realized that his son had learned the most important lesson of all, not from any school, but from living in a family built on choice rather than chance. Outside, snow began to fall, covering the prairie in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new. Tomorrow would bring fresh challenges, but tonight, their little family was safe and whole and loved. And that, Thomas thought, was education enough for any child. The sound of hammers rang across the prairie like a celebration song as spring arrived in 1875 with news that would change their lives forever. Thomas stood watching a crew of railroad surveyors mark boundaries on his land, their bright red flags fluttering in the warm breeze like tiny celebrations. "They want to buy the entire southern strip," Eliza said, reading the official letter for the fourth time that morning. "Enough money to pay off every debt we have and still leave us comfortable for years." 8-year-old Matthew looked up from the arithmetic problems he was solving at the kitchen table. His pencil paused mid-calculation. "Does that mean we're rich now, Papa?" "It means we have choices," Thomas replied, bouncing 3-year-old Hope on his knee while she tried to grab the surveyor's shiny compass. "More choices than we've ever had before." The railroad company's offer was generous beyond their wildest dreams. The new line would bring thousands of settlers through their county, and the depot would sit right on what used to be their cornfield. But money, Thomas had learned, was just another tool. What mattered was how you used it. That evening, after the children were asleep, Thomas and Eliza sat on their porch swing discussing possibilities that seemed too big for ordinary folks like them. "Remember how lost we felt when we first started here?" Eliza said, her hand tracing patterns on her skirt as she thought. "How we had to figure out everything by ourselves. Which seeds to plant, how to preserve food, how to survive the winters. And how Gray Dove taught us about finding water underground," Thomas added. "How the whole community came together during the drought to build the irrigation channels. All that knowledge, scattered among different people," Eliza continued. "What if we could bring it all together in one place? What if we could help new families learn what took us years to figure out?" Thomas felt an idea growing in his mind like a seed finding sunlight. "You mean like a school? But not just for reading and writing." "Exactly. A place where families could learn everything they need to know about living out here. Farming, building, animal care, medicine, even how to get along with neighbors who might be different from them. A school that would accept all children," Thomas said, his voice growing excited, "no matter who their parents are or where they come from." They spent the next hour sketching plans on brown paper, their vision growing bolder with each idea. Joseph Running Bear could teach traditional knowledge about plants and weather. Mrs. Patterson could show women how to treat injuries and illness. Carlos Mendez could demonstrate business skills and record keeping. "And you could teach reading and writing," Thomas said to Eliza, "along with how to make a house feel like home, no matter how rough the circumstances." "What about you?" she asked. "Building, animal husbandry, basic engineering," Thomas replied. "All the things a man needs to know to make a living on the frontier." The next morning, they presented their idea to Matthew over breakfast. "We're thinking about starting a special kind of school," Eliza explained. "One where children and adults could learn together, where everyone would be welcome regardless of their background." Matthew's face lit up with understanding. "You mean Joseph could come learn with me, and other kids like us could have a place where they belong?" "Especially kids like you," Thomas promised. "Kids who are smart and curious and ready to learn about the world." "Could we teach them that families come in all different shapes?" Matthew asked seriously. "That it doesn't matter who your birth parents are if your chosen parents love you?" Thomas felt pride swell in his chest. At 8 years old, his son already understood lessons that many adults struggled with. The planning took 6 months. Thomas rode to every farm and settlement within 50 miles, explaining their vision and asking for support. Some people thought he was crazy. Why would anyone want to mix different kinds of families and teaching styles? But others, especially newer arrivals who felt lost and overwhelmed, embraced the idea immediately. Joseph Running Bear's response surprised everyone. "My grandmother Gray Dove has been dreaming of such a place," he said when Thomas visited the Pawnee camp. "She says the spirits told her that different streams of knowledge must flow together to create wisdom strong enough for the changing times." Dr. Patterson offered to teach basic medical skills to anyone interested. "Too many people die out here from things that could be easily treated," he said. "If we can teach mothers to recognize symptoms and fathers to handle emergencies, we'll save lives." Even Sheriff Williams wanted to contribute. "I could teach basic law and conflict resolution," he offered. "Help people understand their rights and responsibilities as citizens." The most surprising supporter came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Whitfield, the Boston teacher who had rejected Matthew's enrollment, appeared at their door one October evening with an apology and an offer. "I've been thinking about what happened with your son," she said, her cheeks red with embarrassment. "I let fear make my decisions instead of doing what was right. If you'll have me, I'd like to help with your school." "What changed your mind?" Eliza asked. "I watched Joseph and Matthew working together at the Harvest Festival," Mrs. Whitfield replied. "They were helping younger children with their reading, switching between English and Pawnee to make sure everyone understood. I realized I'd been teaching rules and facts, but they were teaching understanding and friendship." Construction began in November. The railroad company donated lumber and hardware as part of their land purchase agreement. Volunteers came from every corner of the county, German immigrants who knew about efficient heating systems, Swedish families with carpentry skills, Mexican vaqueros who understood how to work with adobe and stone. Even the Pawnee contributed, sharing techniques for making buildings that could withstand prairie storms and bitter winters. Gray Dove herself, now very old but still sharp-minded, came to bless the foundation and share traditional ceremonies for new beginnings. "This place will be a bridge," she said through Joseph's translation, her ancient hands touching the cornerstone, "a bridge between the old ways and the new ways, between different peoples who must learn to walk together if any are to survive." The Hartwell Learning Center opened its doors on a bright spring morning in 1876. The sign outside read, "All children welcome. Learning for life on the prairie." Thomas stood watching the first day unfold with amazement that bordered on disbelief. 23 children from 11 different families filled the main classroom. Ages ranged from 5 to 15. Backgrounds from Pawnee to German to Mexican to former slaves seeking new opportunities in the West. Instead of the chaos Thomas had feared, he saw eager faces bent over books and projects. Joseph Running Bear taught tracking and plant identification in the morning. Mrs. Patterson demonstrated bandaging and basic first aid to the older girls. Thomas showed carpentry techniques while Matthew and 2 other experienced students helped younger children measure and cut wood safely. In the center of it all, Eliza led reading lessons using books that told stories about all kinds of families built from love rather than tradition, families that overcame hardship through cooperation rather than conflict. Mrs. Hartwell, a small voice interrupted his observations. Lucy Chen, now 15, and serving as a teaching assistant, pointed toward the road. "There's someone coming to visit." Thomas looked outside and saw a covered wagon approaching, driven by a young native woman he didn't recognize. Beside her sat an elderly figure that made his heart leap with joy. Gray Dove, making what might be her final journey to see their dream made real. "This is my great-granddaughter, Morning Star," Gray Dove said when Thomas helped her down from the wagon. "She has traveled from the reservation to see what you have accomplished here." Morning Star was perhaps 25 years old, with intelligent dark eyes and graceful hands that spoke as eloquently as her voice. "My great-grandmother told me about the white man who brings different peoples together to learn from each other. I came to see if this was truly possible." Thomas led them through the school, showing how children from vastly different backgrounds worked together on projects, how knowledge flowed freely regardless of who was teaching or learning, how respect and curiosity had replaced fear and suspicion. Morning Star watched everything with careful attention, occasionally asking questions or making observations. When they finished the tour, she was quiet for a long moment. "My great-grandmother was right," she said finally. "You have created what our people call the good path, where different streams flow together to make a river strong enough to carry everyone safely. Would you consider staying?" Eliza asked hopefully. "We need someone who understands traditional healing and can teach children about living in harmony with the land." Morning Star looked at Gray Dove, who nodded with satisfaction. "The spirits led me here for a reason," she said. "I will stay and teach what I know if you will learn what I can share." That day marked the beginning of something extraordinary. Morning Star became the 5th full-time teacher, bringing knowledge about herbal medicine, sustainable farming, and conflict resolution that complemented rather than competed with the other subjects. The years that followed exceeded Thomas's wildest hopes. Children who learned at the Hartwell Center went on to become doctors, teachers, business owners, and territorial officials. More importantly, they carried with them the understanding that differences made communities stronger rather than weaker. Matthew flourished in this environment, growing into a thoughtful young man who could speak 3 languages fluently and had friends from every ethnic group in the county. By age 13, he was helping to teach younger students and had begun talking about starting similar schools in other territories. Hope, now 6 years old, treated the multicultural classroom as perfectly normal. She played equally happily with children whose families spoke German, Spanish, Pawnee, or English, switching between languages as easily as changing clothes. "Papa," Matthew said one spring evening in 1880, when he was 13 and already taller than his mother. I've been thinking about something important. They were sitting on the porch after dinner, watching Hope chase fireflies in the gathering dusk while Eliza finished grading papers from her advanced reading class. What's that, son? When I grow up, I want to start schools like this one in other places. Places where families are struggling to fit in, where children are being left out because they're different. Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. That's a big dream, Matthew. It would mean traveling far from home, facing people who might not understand what you're trying to do. I know, Matthew said seriously, but you and Mama taught me that being different isn't something to hide from. It's something to celebrate. And there are probably lots of kids out there who need to learn that lesson. What would you need from me to make that happen? Your help planning the schools, your knowledge about building and organizing, and your blessing to carry on what we started here. Thomas looked at his son, no longer the scared 5-year-old who couldn't attend the local school, but a confident young man with vision and purpose, and felt overwhelming pride. You'll have all of that, Thomas promised, and more. 20 years later, when Thomas was approaching 60 and his hair had gone completely gray, a reporter from the territorial newspaper came to write about the Hartwell Learning Center and its impact on the region. What made you decide to start a school that welcomed everyone? The reporter asked, his pencil poised over his notebook. Thomas thought about all the ways he could answer that question. He could talk about the drought that taught them cooperation. He could mention Gray Dove's wisdom about different streams flowing together. He could describe the day Matthew was bullied for being different. Instead, he chose the simplest truth. My wife came to me carrying a child that wasn't mine by blood, but became mine by choice, he said. That child taught me that love builds stronger families than fear ever could. The school just grew from that same understanding. And what do you consider your greatest achievement? Thomas looked out over the bustling town that had grown around their school. Children of all backgrounds played together in the streets. Businesses thrived because cooperation had replaced competition. Families helped each other instead of judging each other. But what made him proudest was something smaller and more personal. My greatest achievement, he said, is that my children learn they have the power to choose who they become, regardless of where they started. And they're teaching that lesson to the next generation. As the reporter left, Thomas saw his family gathering for their weekly Sunday dinner. Matthew, now a young man of 23 running his own school in Montana Territory, had brought his wife Morningstar and their infant daughter. Hope, 16, and preparing to attend teachers college, helped Eliza set the table while chattering about her plans to specialize in early childhood education. 4 generations of chosen family, Thomas reflected. Not bad for a man who once thought he'd live and die alone. As they held hands around the dinner table, Thomas looked at each beloved face and realized that their greatest legacy wasn't the school or the town or even the hundreds of students who had passed through their doors. Their greatest legacy was the simple proof that love could indeed conquer fear, that different streams could flow together to create something beautiful, and that every child, no matter how they came into the world, deserved a place where they belonged. Thank you, he said quietly, speaking to his family but thinking of all the forces that had brought them together, for choosing to build something beautiful with me. And in the warm glow of lamplight, surrounded by the people who had chosen to love him and whom he had chosen to love in return, Thomas Hartwell understood that he had lived a life worth living. In the end, we are all children of the prairie, shaped by harsh winds, strengthened by adversity, and grown tall by reaching toward the light together.